Hello, this video about Romeo and Juliet is requested by Isha Rahman. Can you do a video on the key themes from Romeo and Juliet, please? Yes, I can, and it's going to be a little bit unusual. One of the ways to have a much more in-depth interpretation of a text is to think of it from the outside. So I'm going to look at the idea of the patriarchy, the idea that this is a society controlled by men. I'm going to look at it as a piece of anti-Catholic propaganda. I'm going to look at it as a tragedy in the Greek tradition where the three fates controlled man's destiny. I'm going to look at it as a morality play in which it seeks to teach moral lessons to the audience. I'm also going to look at it as social commentary, Shakespeare reacting to society at the time and perhaps trying to change it. And finally, I'm going to look at a Marxist interpretation that looks at the desire to maintain power through wealth. So a patriarchal society is one in which men outweigh women in terms of their influence and power. There is another characteristic which we can see here. A system in which both women and men participate, so women are forced to or choose to collude in keeping men in power. So if we look at Romeo and Juliet that way, the great tragedy of the play is that Juliet does not have autonomy. She can't choose who to marry or when to marry. Instead, she is the commodity, the property of her parents, and in particular her father. Now, Capulet asks his wife to persuade Juliet to marry Paris. Initially, he does that out of concern. In the patriarchal society, the job of the nobility is to marry their daughters to the richest and most well-connected and noble families. And by any stretch of the imagination, Paris is the best match that a man like Capulet could possibly arrange. In Shakespearean times, this is the act of a perfect father. However, it all goes wrong when he accelerates from saying to Tybalt, wait 2 more summers until she has bloomed. In other words, wait till she's 15 or 16 and she's more mature and ready for marriage. But then the death of Tybalt upsets everything, and he's forced, or he feels forced, to marry her off much more quickly, and he forces his wife to go along with that decision. Now, in this society, a woman's position is not only to be the wife, but actually purely to bring up children. And the tragedy of the Capulets is that all their children have died. Juliet is the only one left. The nurse has a similar tragedy. She only had one daughter, it seems, and her daughter also died at the same time that Juliet was tiny, which is why she was able to nursemaid Juliet. The women in the play purely exist to serve men, and that's why the nurse abandons Juliet when Juliet wants her help and suggests that she's got to marry Paris, even though the nurse already knows that Juliet is married to Romeo and actually will go to hell in the eyes of the church for marrying bigamously if she marries Paris while still legally in the eyes of the church married to Romeo. So all the tragedy stems from the fact that her parents literally own her and can decide what she has to do. Her only option, in her eyes, is to rebel through marrying for love with Romeo. And then when that doesn't work, when Romeo commits suicide thinking she's dead, she would rather kill herself than put her hands in the life of her family and in the hands of her father. And if you think about it, she's got the possibility of escape with Paris, but that would just be becoming the property of another man. And so we can see her suicide as a protest against her lack of choice and autonomy. She is a woman caught in a patriarchal society that forces her to make the only choice left open to her, which is to kill herself. Okay, another way of interpreting the play is to think about Shakespeare's religion. So this is Wikipedia, and it's dealing with the uncertainty around Shakespeare's religious beliefs. Was he a Church of England Protestant? Was he still a Catholic, were his family Catholic sympathisers, or was he in fact an atheist? And we can look at the play for some clues. So I'm going to suggest that the play can be interpreted as an anti-Catholic one. So the friar forms our image of the archetypal Catholic. Friar Lawrence is duplicitous. He's willing to marry Romeo to Juliet behind the backs of both parents. He says that he's doing it in order to bring the two families together, but actually we can see it as high-risk meddling. So in this view, the lovers would not have married and therefore would not have ended up committing suicide had the friar not married them against the family's wishes. We can see this as Shakespeare trying to ingratiate himself with Queen Elizabeth, whose father took the church away from Catholicism and invented, if you like, the Church of England, the Anglican Church. So the play could be a way of Shakespeare trying to ingratiate himself with the monarch. And further evidence will be the fact that 4 years later, Queen Elizabeth is succeeded by King James II, and Shakespeare's players become the king's players. In other words, his attempt to get royal patronage, royal favour works. So we can look at the play as a way of attacking Catholic society in order to ingratiate himself with Elizabeth I. And other ways that the Catholic society is attached is this whole idea of revenge. Revenge dramas were seen as a particularly Catholic thing. So we've got a play like the Spanish tragedy, in which everybody is out to avenge themselves against everybody else, and it ends up with slaughter portrayed on stage. And this whole idea of the vengeful feud between the families is a satire against the Catholic way of doing things. And that is another contributing factor to the tragedy. Obviously, if the families weren't at war with each other, then the tragedy wouldn't have unfolded the way it had. And Shakespeare could be portraying these two families, Capulets and the Montagues, as behaving in a highly irrational and therefore Catholic way. Another way of interpreting the play is that it's in the Greek tradition of tragedy, and the lives of the characters are controlled by the three fates. The three fates' roles were different. They have the power to control destiny. One of them, Clotho the spinner, spins the thread of life. Lachesis, the measurer, chooses the lot of life a man has, and Atropos, at death, uses her shears to cut the thread of life. In other words, the characters in the play, if we just confine ourselves to Romeo and Juliet, are given life purely in order for Lachesis to choose for them to meet. And crucial to this interpretation is Romeo's line that he can see his fortune in the stars, and his mind misgives at this. I don't know if you remember, but just before he goes to the Capulet ball, he tells Mercutio that he's had this premonition, and then he turns to God. Imagines God as a pilot on a ship steering his course. In other words, he's giving up his life to fate. And then we can also see the actions of fate when he's banished, but Balthadar, the friar isn't able to get a message to him telling him about Juliet and the fake death that he's planned, because there's a plague in the town, and this plague itself is also fate intervening, meaning that Romeo will always find out that Juliet's dead, even when she's not, and that his suicide becomes inevitable. And because he kills himself, Juliet kills herself, and there's an inevitability about the whole thing. And if we look at the ending of the play, it confirms what we already knew at the beginning, that this was a tragedy of star-crossed lovers, and this idea that the fortune or the fate is written in the stars is a deliberate reference to the tragedy of fate. And in this view, Shakespeare is arguing that actually our destinies are mapped out and we can't alter them. We just have to play out our parts on stage like actors in the 2-hour traffic of our stage, which is what the prologue tells us the play will last. And just like actors, we play our parts, we can't choose them, and we can't change them. God or the fates has already written what they're going to be. So really we can only enjoy the moment like Romeo and Juliet do. They seize the moment, they seize the day, because life is brief and we can't predict how it's going to end. Okay, the next interpretation is of the play as a morality play. Now, morality plays were in fact the first plays, and the idea was that Christian stories were introduced, not necessarily from the Bible, but with Christian messages and characters playing angels, demons, with a view to teaching with a moral purpose. So what is a morality play? Here is a quick description. So 100 years before Shakespeare's writing, these plays become popular. The characters are allegorical, not necessarily real, but they portray the soul's struggle to achieve salvation. Now this is given a secular twist in Romeo and Juliet, where the salvation sought is through the marriage and through love. Romeo and Juliet seek to avoid the feuds of their families by uniting together, marrying for love instead of through an arranged marriage. But if we take this a little further, Shakespeare could be criticising Romeo and Juliet's view of morality. And actually, the play could be an attack against teenage rebellion. The teenagers rebel against the parents, and what is the result? It's their death. And had they instead obeyed their parents' instructions in life, they might all have lived happily ever after, or at least they might all have lived. Alternatively, you could see the morality play being quite different to that, and he might be suggesting that the moral of the play is that parental interference, forcing rich children, if you like, to marry for financial reasons and for political alliances between powerful families, that itself is morally wrong, and that's what leads to the tragedy of their deaths. So you choose which kind of morality play you think it is. And to help you do that, you might consider the role of social commentary. So Shakespeare could be very critical of teenagers, if you like, in this play. If we look at all the young males in the play, they're all teenagers. They all behave in ways that are bound to escalate violence. All the men are obsessed with sex. There's barely a page of the play that doesn't have one of the male characters making some sort of sexual joke. They're obsessed with violence. Tybalt is obsessed with dueling and wants to fight at every opportunity, and so does Mercutio. And actually the tragedy of the play there is teenage male posturing, which again you can link to the patriarchy. Well, if this helped, subscribe.